I see a lot of murmuring. So before you ask, yes, we are friends. We almost kept our name tags, but we thought it would be more fun this way. But yeah, Adam and I, we founded TeSPA about 7 years ago in 2010. So we were on a single university campus. We were at UT Austin. You guys can cheer. All right. We were at UT Austin, and we saw what at the time was a very small but passionate community about gaming. There were all of these students who kind of loved gaming at the time but didn't really have an outlet for it. And what we saw was when we brought those students together, it quickly grew. We started hosting meetings and events, and pretty rapidly it grew to be one of the largest student organizations on campus at the time. Fast forward a couple years, Adam and I decided to take the organization and expand nationally, which brings us to where we are today. TeSPA is composed of two primary pillars, if you will. We have a community pillar, which is all about chapters and members and really trying to build infrastructure on campuses. Right now, we're at 220 chapters across North America. To put that in perspective, if TeSPA were a Greek organization, we would be the 7th largest Greek organization in the world, which I think is just a testament to how quickly gaming is growing and how interested college students are engaging with others on their campus in like-minded activities. The second pillar is competitive, so we're all about building tournaments and leagues. This year we have 3 premier leagues. Over the last couple years, we've drew in competitors from almost 1,200 different universities to compete in our leagues and given out approximately $1.3 million in scholarships. So there's a lot of interest on the competitive level that we find very interesting because it feeds back to education and trying to support these groups. You'll see on the slide there's a couple other things that Adam and I have had the opportunity to participate in our time at Blizzard. We created and led Heroes of the Dorm, which we'll talk about a little bit more detail in a few minutes. We led BlizzCon from the eSports perspective for 3 years, so one of the pinnacle professional events. We helped launch Fireside Gatherings, which is a grassroots initiative for Hearthstone, tens of thousands of events worldwide. And now we focus a lot on the Blizzard eSports side in terms of strategies, strategic initiatives, long-term planning for the team. So we bring all that up to say we've had the opportunity to see a lot in the esports industry, and one of the things that remains most interesting to us is college and the opportunity that college esports has to grow in the next few years.
Right, so what we're going to talk about today is a couple of things. One, we want to explain and share with everyone why you should be thinking about college esports, and we're going to do that in the best way that we know how to, which is to share with you why we care about college esports and why we think it's a market with a lot of potential that has just barely begun to be explored. Secondly, we're going to share just a couple key lessons from some of the major tournaments that we've done, things that we found really interesting that we hope you'll find interesting too, and then afterwards we'll take questions. So Tyler, walk us through a little bit about college esports.
Spoilers here. We'll jump right into it because I know we're a little low on time. The first is the demographic. So the college demographic, this is no secret to everyone who's been involved in marketing and brand marketing. College is very interesting. What we saw when we were actually involved at the campus level is there was a disconnect between what we were seeing on college campuses and who those gamers actually were, and then what we were hearing, right? 7 years ago, I mean, people would slink into our meetings and kind of be afraid to say they were a gamer, right? They would slink in, they're like, I play games, and I've heard of StarCraft and all of this stuff, right? So what we sought to do was kind of codify and figure out how many people are actually playing games. So we invested in a lot of research into the market, and what we found is almost half of college students are actively playing games or consider themselves gamers at large, and that was really interesting to us. Again, a testament to how quickly that market is growing and the future that esports has. The next thing, students game mostly as a way to socially connect, right? We always think about gaming as I'm playing a game because I enjoy that game, and that's part of it. But on the college level, there's a much more important component, which is the social connection. This is the way that the next generation of college students are connecting with each other. There's also, of course, a lot of STEM components here, right? People who are involved in gaming, and this is no secret either, are extremely technical. They're extremely focused on math, science, technology. Almost half of the people who identify themselves as gamers are STEM majors. If we look at just TeSPA members, that jumps up to 70%, which tells us it's a really underrepresented demographic in a lot of the other social activities on campus and has the potential to grow. The last point, which isn't up here, but I think is worth mentioning also, is that college students are very passionate about their hobbies, especially college gamers. They kind of come from this world where they're trying to make a name for themselves, but at the end of the day, they support brands that support them. In the research we did, we found out TeSPA members are 60% more likely to purchase a sponsored product just because they're supporting their hobby. This is how undertapped this market is and how interested those students are in supporting those brands who support them and recognize them.
Cool. So next, one of the other reasons why we think that college esports is super interesting and something that we should be paying attention to is that we really find it as the bridging of two worlds, between this world of esports and this world of traditional sports. So a lot of times when Tyler and I are talking to people who don't really know about esports for the first time, we like to describe it as really the merging of a few different industries, of sports, of entertainment, and of technology. And just like with sports and entertainment, with esports, we find that there's a spectrum of fans, where on one side you have the super highly hyper-engaged fans who know everything there is about esports, about leagues. They can tell you stats that they have memorized. They can tell you about this week's match. They can talk for hours about their favorite player. And then on the other side, we have the more casual gamer, right? The guys who like playing games, but really, as of now, aren't super hyper-connected into the world of esports, right? Where they might watch it if they see it, but they definitely aren't looking for that content. So what we found, actually, is that college esports is a really interesting way to connect that really more casual fan into the world of esports, and they become more engaged through that. And when we look at why, I think one of the biggest reasons for this is our culture. So if you've grown up in the US, chances are you have a pretty good understanding of college sports, right? So regardless of if you've ever played college sports or watched or followed a team, I bet you have a pretty good understanding of the overall structures. You have a pretty good understanding of powerhouse schools. You have a pretty good idea of how the formats work, where teams play each other. And what we find is that with college esports, a lot of that is very similar. So we create this level of familiarity with the content without knowing anything about the game initially. So a lot of times, if you take that casual fan, the person who plays games but doesn't identify as an esports enthusiast, and you sit them down and you show them Cloud9 versus Fnatic, they might not have a hook, right? They might not know they might not understand what's happening, right? But if you sit them down and you say, great, this is Texas versus Oklahoma, or this is Michigan versus Ohio State, a lot of times they'll see, oh, okay, I kind of get it. And that's kind of an entryway in where they learn more. So what we found is that really by playing that up, there's a hook for the audience. And hopefully, if we're doing our jobs creating really compelling content, they fall in love, and it speaks for itself. So what we're finding is that college and this element of college sports really creates a common ground that reduces some of these barriers that we see traditionally with esports.
Cool. The last point, the stakes are getting bigger. One of the things we are most excited about in the college market is that it's a very dynamic market. It's evolving every day. It's changing every day. More people are taking notice and trying to get involved. And that's really interesting. A couple examples we'll call out. If we kind of take a trip back in time to about a year and a half, 2 years ago, a lot of students were involved in college esports, but a lot of the traditional institutions and entities, they weren't really involved, right? They were kind of ignoring it. It was this thing students did. Now that's the opposite of the case. We've seen esports varsity programs pop up, literally programs inside universities that scholarship esports athletes to play and represent their university. This was started by RMU a few years ago. Now there's over 20 different universities with official esports programs embedded into either the athletics program within their school or the student life program, which we think is pretty exciting. We've also seen universities get involved on a more widespread level, not only from the competitive level, but from the research level and more of the academia level, like UCI recently. So there's a lot of universities moving to try to figure out how they service this group within their student base. The second is we've seen a lot of athletic conferences get involved. It's really hard to talk about sports without mentioning conferences. You know the Power Five, right? You know the Pac-12, you know the Big Ten, you know the ACC. These institutions now are looking at esports as a way that they can extend their reach to this demographic and again service that market. Pac-12 announced esports esports initiatives with ESL last year. Right now, the Big Ten is streaming esports on their network. So we think this really, in total, is an indication that the infrastructure is building and that there's more interest every day. And I think it will be hard to ignore esports in the college level once we build out this infrastructure and as more entities become involved. The last point, which we kind of touched on earlier, there's a lot of tuition at stake. We're beginning to fund education for these players in the same way we fund traditional sports, and we think that's a really special evolution.
Great. So next we're going to share some key lessons from Heroes of the Dorm. For those of you who don't know, Heroes of the Dorm is one I would call the largest and most premier collegiate esports competition in the world. Heroes of the Dorm offers full scholarships, full college tuition for the winning team for their entire college career. Last year we had over 400 universities field teams to participate and gathered over 1 billion press impressions. One of the things that's interesting about Heroes of the Dorm and makes it pretty noteworthy, it was actually the first live esports competition broadcast on Espn. And through that, actually turned a lot of heads and created a really interesting national dialogue about what is the place of esports? Is it really a sport? Should we have more of this? And it created a really helpful conversation. The next year, we've done Heroes of the Dorm. This is our 3rd year right now. The next year, a lot of those questions evaporated, and we saw that people started to accept it and say, wow, you know what, this is really great. This is really interesting. I don't know a lot about it, but it's cool and I want to see more of it.
Cool. So the first lesson, actually 3 lessons we're going to talk through. First is the accessibility of college esports. The second is the importance of storytelling and content mix to really engage those fans. And then the third is how we actually have engaged fans within this overarching program. So the first is accessibility. So through the first couple of Heroes of the Dorm programs, we saw something that was really interesting to us, and that was a lot of traditional brands, including universities, including sports teams, including celebrities, get involved with the conversation. And we think this was really special and was only made possible because of the college tie-ins. What we found through talking to a lot of these guys is that because college brands are present, it becomes okay to talk about this to a wider net, right? It becomes a hook that their audience can then latch onto and understand. So the takeaway here is that it's really important to build brands and build hooks that people can then take out and promote. You want to build these evangelists who are talking about these programs and building the visibility for not only the program themselves, but esports at large. And we put a couple of them up here. We had the LA Rams tweet about the program. We had each of the universities of the top teams really get involved. After ASU lost to Cal the first year, they tweeted the date of their next football game. So there's a lot of opportunity, we think, for these big brands that are traditionally embedded in college sports to now become involved in esports because of the extension of the market.
Great. The next thing we're going to talk a little bit about is the importance of storytelling in the esports space. One of the challenges that we have with collegiate tournaments specifically is that there's a pretty high turnover of the players that are involved, right? We have players who are entering college with no name at all that we suddenly have to make people care about. And at the same hand, we have players that are graduating both from college, but also evolving into pro teams and no longer playing for their universities. So one of the things that we had to focus on when we created Heroes of the Dorm was really telling stories about that constant, which is the universities. And we found that it was actually a pretty big blessing in disguise. One of the reasons why I think sports is so compelling is that we take a lot of interest in following the teams, following their stories, and putting ourselves in their shoes, right? When a team is about to break the all-time record for consecutive wins, that's something that we get behind and we root for. Or when a player is about to hit their career 100th home run, right? It's interesting to us. So we took a similar approach with Dorm, where we really said, okay, in order to build storylines, we should focus on 2 things. One of those is stats. So we really dug deep within our games and really looked at the teams that we're playing and tried to create personas around them. So we created strengths and weaknesses by looking at how they perform in game, what is their team composition, when are they taking their first objectives within the game, how are they more aggressive or defensive. And by doing that, we were able to really create these identities around teams that sometimes had players that nobody had heard of in their lives, but suddenly were interested in because they had some sort of hook. Another thing we focused on was really creating a pretty robust stream of content. So telling stories within a single broadcast of a match, we found, is actually kind of difficult. There's not a lot of time. So we put a lot of emphasis on telling stories from the start to the finish. So looking at highlights, pre-game shows, post-game shows. We even made a documentary that was focused on the top 4 teams and their story and their path to that final stage. And in doing so, we were able to shine some light on the human interest piece, which we found really caused a need, or caused the audience to connect with these teams in a way that hadn't been done before. So our takeaway here is that by focusing on storytelling, we can create identities. And identities at the end of the day is what we connect with as fans. Great. Final one, engagement is key. One of the interesting things about the Heroes of the Dorm program is it follows a format that's very similar to March Madness. So there's a regular season followed by playoffs. And after those playoffs, we take the top 64 teams and we seed them into a bracket. And after the bracket, they play down towards the national championship, right? What we did was we released a bracket challenge where fans could go online and they could fill out a bracket of the teams that they thought would make it towards the finals, and they'd win prizes depending on how correct they were. One thing that really surprised us here is when people started filling out these brackets, we saw them coming in from all over the globe. So we have this North American program with North American colleges broadcasting on a North American TV network that suddenly had people around the world caring about it. We thought it was interesting and we followed it, and what we found was that by filling out these brackets, sometimes we had people from countries all around the world rooting for teams they'd never heard of before, right? The week before, they may have never heard of Carleton versus Boston College, but when that game came on, they sure were rooting for a winner there because they had this investment. So one of the things that we learned is by creating this investment, we get continued engagement throughout the program, which we think is really key to having a really vibrant ecosystem of fans that are engaging.
Awesome. So we tried to blast through it. I think we have 4-ish minutes left for questions. We'd love to open it up, start having a dialogue.
Sure, we got a question right here, and the mic is on its way down.
Do the college students get paid?
So right now, they don't get paid in the traditional sense. What we see as the future is actually college athletes getting scholarshiped and having their education funded by their performance and their involvement in both university teams and non-university teams. So it's not a salary per se, but it very closely right now resembles what we see in traditional college sports, where they're actually getting their education funded by participating.
Do they also, if they play in the college, can they play professionally in other tournaments that pay?
Yeah, it's a great question, actually. So this is something that we're really approaching on a game-by-game basis. I think in our perfect world, there's a separation between college and professional, the same way that you don't see an NBA star play in a college basketball game. But different games have different definitions of what professionals are, right? A professional for Heroes of the Storm, for example, is very different than a professional for Hearthstone. Hearthstone is anyone can win. It's very accessible. There's lots of new players coming in. Heroes, actually, it's a closed ecosystem, and there's salaries for the top teams. So what we try to do is then set a definition for what a pro is per game, and then stay true to that as much as we can throughout the franchise.
Is the NCAA trying to get involved?
Question is, by the way, because we're on live stream, is the NCAA trying to get involved?
Is the NCAA trying to get involved? We're not sure. Probably they're interested. We're not really sure.
Other questions out here? Other questions? There's a question way over there.
Cool.
Makes you all want to go back to college, doesn't it? If I could go to school for playing games, I would totally do it.
What a world.
Hey, it's never too late.
With so many gamers getting the revenue from Twitch and streaming on Twitch, how do you guys balance your participants getting revenue from Twitch and streaming and also playing collegiate sports?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one of the things that we think is really important when we look at developing the college esports landscape is I don't think that it would be very wise of us to disrupt the landscape that exists, right? So a lot of times the way that players monetize and they support themselves is by streaming. They get subscriptions, they'll post videos, which they'll monetize against. We think that that still plays a very valuable role in building these players up as personalities and as stars. And we think that if we were to say you can no longer do that, that removes their livelihood, and we don't think it's worth it. So right now we're fully embracing the idea that a top player should be expanding their brand, and they should be monetizing, and they should be streaming while still playing for their university.
Yeah, this is one of those things, again, where we want to stay authentic to the market and to the players. Like, all of these players have grown up playing in local tournaments, streaming online, building their brands. For us to come in and cut that off, I don't think is the right choice.
Cool. So we're about out of time. I have a real quick question for you. Give an example of a brand that's done something unexpected but that worked out, or a lesson that a brand learned in trying to approach this audience that may not be initially obvious, but that turned out that way.
Interesting. It's a good question.
Well, I think when we talk about brands and Heroes of the Dorm specifically, I think the one that is the most obvious probably is ESPN getting involved with esports. I think a lot of times when we look, or people think about the esports market and they think about gamers, they think that the sports fan and the gamer are completely different and that it's two separate demographics. But I think what we learned through actually kind of merging those two worlds is that there is actually a lot of overlap. We have almost half of people in colleges who identify themselves as gamers, right? And a huge, I mean, it's almost impossible to go to school and not be aware and involved with your school's sports team, right? So I think that the lesson there was actually the populations and the demographics are a little bit different from maybe what the initial instinct is, and that there's a lot of opportunity and potential to continue building upon that.
Yeah, the other thing I think I'll add there on a more tactical level is we've seen a lot of brands try to get into college in a couple different ways. And what I mean by that is we go back to the beginning where we talked about TeSPA having two really big pillars, right? We had the more community-focused chapter focused on the ground experience. And then we have the premier experience, which is a lot more broad in terms of non-college students. So we've seen a lot of brands try to attack that ecosystem from both ends, making sure that they have placement and they have visibility on the ground within these really passionate communities. But at the same time, they still have visibility for the broad kind of premier competitions, just like you would see in professional sports. So I think that's interesting, and I think that's something that we'll also see expand as we move forward and see more brands enter the space.
Cool. UT ever show up in the final 16?
We are top 4 right now for Overwatch finals happening this weekend, so we're getting there.
Congratulations, Tyler and
Thank
Adam.
you.
Thank you guys very much. That was awesome.